Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. In this video, I'm just going to talk about a claim that's been made recently that you could just change the referendum questions so that it only deals with recognition instead, which people say would be much more popular and therefore pass. But can you do that and still hold the referendum on the 14th of October? And the answer is no, you can't, because it would be contrary to the law and contrary to the Constitution. So let me explain that. Let's just go through the words of the Constitution first so that you know what it is that you're actually doing when you're voting in a referendum. So section 128 of the Constitution says this: "This Constitution shall not be altered except in the following manner." Okay, so the first clue there is what you're doing when you have a referendum is that you are altering the Constitution. Then it says, "The proposed law for the alteration thereof must be passed by an absolute majority of each House of the Parliament, and not less than 2 nor more than 6 months after its passage through both Houses, the proposed law shall be submitted in each state and territory to the electors qualified to vote for the election of the members of the House of Representatives." It then goes on to give another method of doing it if you don't have the agreement of both houses, but that's not relevant for these purposes, so we're going to leave that bit out. Okay, so what does that tell us that we need to know? Well, it tells us that what we're dealing with is a proposed law for the alteration of the Constitution. Okay, the term proposed law is often used instead called a bill for Parliament. So the thing that's proposed to be a law, which eventually becomes a statute or an act of Parliament. So this proposed law is the thing that is put to the voters in the referendum. Now, section 128 then goes on. There's other bits in the middle that I've missed out because they're not terribly relevant, but it then goes on to say this: "When a proposed law is submitted to the electors, the vote shall be taken in such manner as the Parliament prescribes." Okay, that's important because it means that Parliament is allowed to legislate, to enact a law which sets out the method for voting. So how you do it, what your ballot looks like, all those sorts of things. So it allows Parliament to make those kind of details. A bit like with the voice referendum, you're allowing Parliament to fill in the detail. Okay, same here in section 128. But then it goes on and it says, "And if in a majority of the states, a majority of the electors voting approve the proposed law, and if a majority of all the electors voting also approve the proposed law, it shall be presented to the Governor-General for the Queen's assent." Okay, so what that means is that that's how the referendum passes. And again, what are the voters doing when they vote in that referendum? They're voting to approve the proposed law. Now, this is really important because people often say, oh, well, why doesn't your referendum question say something like, do you want a republic? Or do you approve recognition of Indigenous people or whatever? But they're general policy questions, okay? What a referendum does is that it approves the proposed law, and the law contains the terms of the alteration for the Constitution, the words that alter the Constitution. So that's what you're voting on. You're not voting on some broader policy proposition. You're voting on approving a proposed law which contains the words that you are going to put into or take out of the Constitution, the words of the alteration. So on that basis, no, you can't possibly have a constitutional referendum that says, do you approve recognition of Indigenous Australians? Because that's not asking you to approve a proposed law. All right, so if you are asked to approve a proposed law, how do you identify the law? How do you put that on the ballot paper so people know what it is? Right? So you identify a proposed law by reference to its title. Now, all Acts of Parliament in Australia have 2 titles. They have what's known as the short title, which does what it says on the box, and that is it's the short version for what you call the thing. But it also has what's known as the long title, which was historically the sort of title that they used to give in the United Kingdom, where it'd have a longer description of what it is that the relevant bill does. So the long title is the thing that describes sometimes what the purpose of the bill is, but importantly, the scope of the bill. Now, the reason that a long title of a bill is important is that under the standing orders of the Parliament, so they're the rules that the Houses use to pass legislation, you can't make an amendment to a bill as it passes through the Parliament unless that amendment falls within the scope of what is described in the long title. So the long title is usually relatively broad. They don't often put in a lot of specifics because it's confusing and unnecessary to put in a whole shopping list. So the long title won't describe every single detail of an act. It will give you the general purpose of it and the sorts of things that, if an amendment was made, would appropriately fall within it. So let me just give you a couple of examples. These are just random examples of commonly used acts. So the Privacy Act, 1988, for example, has a long title of An Act to Make Provision to Protect the Privacy of Individuals and for Related Purposes. Or the Freedom of Information Act, 1982, its long title is An Act to Give to Members of the Public Rights of Access to Official Documents of the Government, of the Commonwealth and of its agencies. So it gives you the general idea of what the thing is. And so that's what happens when we vote at a referendum, because under the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act, it says that when you ask voters to approve the proposed law that contains the alteration to the Constitution, you do it by reference to the long title of that bill. So it will ask you to approve a proposed law by reference to the long title of that bill to amend the Constitution. So if you wanted to change the referendum question in order to comply with both the Constitution, which requires you to refer to the proposed law, to approve the proposed law, and to meet the requirements of the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act, you would have to change the long title to this constitution alteration in order to give you the new question. And of course we now know that you can't do that in a way that would still allow you to hold the referendum on the 14th of October because it's too late, because as we saw in section 128, it still has that requirement that you have to hold the referendum at least 2 months after it's been passed by Parliament and no longer than 6 months. So you've got a specified window and you couldn't change it. The other really obvious point to make is the actual alteration itself would have to be changed. When you vote in a referendum and you're approving the proposed law, well, at the moment, the proposed law contains all the details about the voice to Parliament. So you can't just change that by changing the question on the referendum paper. You actually have to go back and change the proposed law itself. So you'd have to remove what's actually in it at the moment, which is all about recognition through a voice, recognising people by listening to their voices through this mechanism. You'd have to ditch that altogether and put in some other kind of recognition. Now, who knows what kind of recognition that could be? You might want to insert a preamble into the Constitution. John Howard proposed doing that back in 1999 and ran a referendum question on it, and it failed miserably. But if you did that, you'd have to think about, well, what other things would you put into a preamble? And what effect would that preamble have? Could it be used for the interpretation of the entire Constitution? What impact would that have? There's a whole lot of legal issues there, not something you can just come up with and do like that. Or would you put some other substantive provision in the Constitution? And if you did, what would it say? And what would its purpose be? And how would it fit in with the rest of the Constitution? These are all quite big issues that would need to be figured out and clearly haven't been at the moment. So if someone is telling you, oh, it's easy, we just change the question so that it's just in relation to recognition of Indigenous people and we can hold our referendum on the 14th of October and all is good, well, they're talking absolute rubbish. They have no idea about what the Constitution itself says or the legislation that controls how you hold referendums, etc. So best thing to do is just not listen to them. Thank you very much. Glad you were listening to the Constitutional Clarion, and I'll see you next time. Good night.